I've been asked to give just a brief introduction to Thomas Annan, just so that I kind of get you into the right mindset. I'm quite sure that I'm speaking to an audience of people who know exactly what I'm talking about and can visualize it with no trouble. But just to do this, assuming this works, yes. Thomas Annan was one of our most important and significant photographers. He worked at a time in the second generation of people who were undertaking photography, and he is one of a highly distinguished group of people who have made Scottish photography from that very beginning a subject which is of interest, as you will gather, across the whole of the world. This material is in collections all over the States, Canada, and Japan, and so forth, so that it's all over the place, and it is part of the international understanding of Scottish culture. And I haven't said this for a couple of years, so I'm going to say it now. In my opinion, photography is the key Scottish visual art, in the sense that it's the first art form that we practiced from the very beginning to the highest possible level. It's an art form that we were in there, not just undertaking photography, but influencing what happened, what came after. I've been saying this for about 20 years and nobody's contradicted me yet, but do feel free to... people mention the Pibroch occasionally, that's possible. Thomas Annan was... we were talking about this yesterday, theoretically a businessman, but in fact I'm not sure he was a particularly successful businessman, in the very simple sense that he was, possibly like all of you, somebody who had a passion for what he was doing and also had to make money. And the two things don't necessarily go together, as you know too well. If you really want to take photographs which are the ones you want to take, that's not necessarily where people will give you money to do it. So he is that kind of photographer. However, one of his first commissions, which was, he worked with engineers, he worked with artists, architects, industrialists, a whole raft of people. One of his first big commissions is the first time that Glasgow really sets out to try and sort out the awful problems they've got in the city as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which has hit a terrible slump in the 1830s and 40s, which is combined, as you know, with all the problems about the potato famine and disease. People in this city, people are dying of typhoid and cholera, which is unimaginable now. So after the 1848 major cholera epidemic in Glasgow, the city realized that one of the biggest problems was the water supply, which was coming out of wells. And for a city so full of people and industry, this was insane. So they decided to, made the radical decision to bring water down from Loch Catrin to treat this romantic lake celebrated by Walter Scott, which was a focus of tourism, treat it as a reservoir, which is an extraordinary thing to do in the first place. But it's, what did you say yesterday, 27 miles away? Yeah. And it's, of course, up in the high ground, and there were no roads. So one way or another, it was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It was an absolutely astonishing gesture. And the engineers, Bateman, were able to write it up and say, we've outstripped the Romans, which was a wonderful feeling for them, because they had done something which was quite phenomenal. The thing that was extraordinary about it was that they were using the landscape itself to bring the water down. They discovered that the rock was, for a large part of the journey, impermeable, and what they did was to blast their way through. So the water came down comparatively naturally. And although the engineering works which Annan plotted for them, photographed for them, do contain some very ordinary pipe work, an awful lot of it is invisible. And for me, this photograph is one of his quite fascinating pictures. If you didn't know what this was, you could quite look at it quite happily in context of British photography in the 1950s, to my mind. It's got that sort of episodic, what hell's going on here look. To sum up the British photography movement of the 1950s. Sorry. But if you look at this, what you've got, what he's photographing is a scar and a grid. And that is not a 19th century aesthetic, picturesque idea. So I find that one quite fascinating. And this one, which I also love, the commissioners were very proud of this whole exercise, understandably. And every year they went out on what was an extended picnic. They took Annan out with them and they had the photograph taken. And this one was taken in 1880, which was considerably later. And I love it because this was Gorgie waterfall. And in those days you didn't have leisure wear, so you went out wearing your same city clothes, and the Lord Provost is wearing his chain of office. And somehow Annan has persuaded them to sit on this rock. It's a pretty perilous looking position, and the guys at the front are certainly getting wet. And it's a lovely combination of the wildness, the natural force that they are claiming to have tamed on the right, and the business-like men on the left. So I'm very fond of that one. I'm just talking through a hole in my head here to give you an idea of the kind of ways we got into this subject. His most celebrated series, in the sense that this is the series that all over the world people have discussed for 50, 60 years and have come to a whole raft of different personal conclusions, is the series called The Old Closes and Streets of Glasgow, which were the second great Glasgow venture. That is to say, they were the first city to persuade Parliament to pass an act to allow them to buy property from private owners and demolish it. Slum clearance. It was the first slum clearance exercise. And this was an extraordinary thing to do at the time. And that is a group of not very much more than 31 photographs, though it's bigger than we think it is, which Annan took between 1868 and 1871. And one of the things we'll come back to this one, but I think that the whole question of why he did it is still open. But what I would like to just show you with this photograph is that Glasgow at that time was heavily polluted, like all the other British cities, all the industrial cities, so that smog, the combination of rain and fog and soot, was an almost perpetual condition. And the question is, how do you take photographs in the city streets in the worst affected area in that kind of way? A lot of the photographs do show the conditions under sunshine. This one is taken with the realization that when it has rained and the ground is wet, the blackness of the ground is mitigated and you get reflections upward, and there's even, I suspect, reflections out of the fog and the smog. The particles in the air are shifting right around, because big glass plate negative, you can see that people are moving. And that is very remarkable, very fast at the time. So that's a piece of photographic realization, and I love this picture too. And again, this is the opposite, the sun shining in the salt market. One of the things people say about these photographs is that Annan deliberately cleared people out of the way so that he could photograph the old buildings. Well, no, he didn't. And this, to me, is very important as a photograph in which the whole question about whether people going into conditions of this kind are using what we call the outsider's gaze. For me, it's the other way around. This is the insider's gaze. They're all looking at him. It's a totally different idea that he's standing in the middle of the street with his camera. He's an object of fascination to them. So they're there thinking about him at the same time that he's thinking about them. This is one of the closes and illustrates amongst other things, the appalling conditions that he was working with, not just from the point of view of the people, but also, of course, from the point of view of photography. This was pretty well impossible as a photographic exercise. You can see from the focal problems there, but nevertheless you've got the basic thing of which you find in most of the photographs. He usually has the sun shining down them, and he usually has the way out, which I think is very important. One of the other things is the whole question of there are quite a few people in this one, but also the washing and I draw your attention to the street lamp. Come back to that later. They are quite fascinating and beautiful photographs, and there's always this problem of whether we should be thinking of them as beautiful because of the subject, which is so distressing. Now, this one was one that was, for me, was one of the principal revelations, because when you look at pictures over a period of time, there is this extraordinary thing which you may have observed in your own work, that sometimes something appears in a picture which you hadn't even noticed before, that you didn't think you'd taken deliberately. Now, this photograph has been criticized, as I say, 50 to 60 years worth, and nobody has ever noticed the structure, the metal structure, said anything about it. And that proves to be a modern improvement. It's the equivalent of the ensuite bathroom, you might say, in their terms. It's a dry closet. It's not just a urinal. It's a toilet, and it's being put there whilst we're expecting visually and mentally that the place is going to be demolished. So this is, again, a very interesting question the whole thing raises. And in order to demonstrate where you can go with this exciting revelation, I found out that that particular structure was put up by the Saracen Ironworks in Glasgow, by the owner McFarlane, and precisely the same design, and they were all done, again, very modern, all done in different panels that you could have different sizes and shapes, and provided with a cart that came and cleared it out, and the utensils, and presumably the horse as well. So the whole thing is full of information that hasn't properly been considered, and that I find quite fascinating. So just in order to kind of get us out into the fresh air a bit, let's just show you a couple of Annan's landscapes. He moved out to Hamilton himself with his family around about 1860 for the quality of the air. This was about 15 years before the Dukes of Hamilton started to dig up the entire landscape and wreck the air again. But his photographs here, I think, are exquisitely beautiful, and I'm sorry about the flare on these. That's me, that's not his fault. The originals are in the Mitchell Library. Those two wonderful albums there, do go and see them. There's another one at Dumbarton Castle, which again is very carefully considered, very beautiful, very open. I'm aware that what I'm saying has no coherence to it, and just to give you an idea of the kind of things that we were thinking about whilst constructing the book. The book itself is led by Maddox, the curator in the Getty Museum, and her interest was to do with, based on their own collections, that is to say, the publications that Annan produced. Annan realized early on in his career that rather than setting up a studio and inviting people to come in one at a time and have their photograph taken, which is what most people were doing, that what you should do is to publish, to regard the negative, positive process as being an opportunity for producing hundreds, thousands of images, not just one for somebody to take home. So that's the main thesis of the book, and what I've written is the life and the kind of bit of a gallop through the story. But that is essentially it. Well, that's where it started from. So if you're very kind.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Sarah. I was just going to say that I don't have a microphone, so if you can't hear me at the back, just wave. But normally people can hear me. I've got many questions that I could ask you, Sarah, but I'm going to try and just ask 3 or so, and then try and open it up. So if you've got questions, you have the opportunity to ask Sarah directly. Yeah, I mean, I've had a good look at the book and read the book already, and to me, it's kind of a book about books in the sense that it reviews different publications, as you said, and one of the questions, which I think is really good, because I've known about Annan for and read and looked at his pictures for maybe 10 years or so, but always at the forefront of your mind when you think about Thomas Annan is the kind of iconic images of the streets and closes. And I think one of the things that the book achieves is it really puts it into perspective alongside many other significant projects that he did. And of particular interest to me is the one you mentioned about the water being, the pipeline being built through the landscape, over and under, all the way from Loch Katrine down to Glasgow, and in fact to the reservoirs at Mulgai on the way. I guess one question that I've got for you would be that if you were to take the streets and closes pictures out of the equation, how significant do you think the other work is? I mean, has it got weight in its own right that would mean that we would still be looking at images by Annan today, do you think?
I think you've just said so. Because the Waterworks photographs stand on their own. It is true that the old closes and streets have made the international reputation. There were 3 separate editions of them. There was the albumin set, and then there was the carbon set, and then after Annan died, his sons produced the platinum set. So there's a lot of it about, and it's travelled, and people have been absolutely fascinated by them. And one of the reasons why people have been fascinated by them is that the theory has been that he was commissioned to photograph the old buildings, and I was talking to the late great Charles McKean, the architectural historian, about this about 10 years or so ago, and he said the problem with that is that they're not particularly old buildings and they're not noticeably historic. And I thought, and went back to the Mitchell Library and said, please can I see the minutes of the trustees' meetings, the guys who were paying the bills. And read all the way through the trustees' minutes till 1871, and there was no mention of the photographs, and there was no mention of the commission, and there was no mention of payment. It's only in 1871 when the city architect realises that he's got to go back to Parliament because they just haven't achieved what they were trying to do yet, mostly legal complications and unravelling ownership of different properties, that he puts on the table a set of Annan's photographs, and the trustees are all leaning forward going, oh, that's interesting, we'd like a set of those for our own collections. And that's the point at which Annan is paid. So he's been working for 3 years without being paid anything, as far as I can tell. And that is an extraordinarily interesting fact, because if you regard it as a collection of photographs of buildings, they're not really terribly good. And I've read American criticisms in which they say, well, Annan failed to do what he was supposed to be doing, which assumes that there was a commission which said that was what he's supposed to be doing. But if you look at it elsewhere, I think that the interesting thing about them is that they're very curiously beautiful. They are also curiously optimistic. And I think that what he and the city architect were trying to do was 2 things. One was to track what the heck was going on, because they were trying to do it piecemeal. These properties were all kind of interlocked, and he was having terrible trouble buying them up enough in order to get a whole block of them so that he could knock something down. And whilst he was doing that, there was a new police act which said that the property owners were responsible for things like lighting and sewage now. And so the city suddenly found itself as the biggest slum landlord in the place. And they suddenly became responsible for improving the buildings which they were supposed to be knocking down. So this is where the dry closet comes in, this is where the lighting comes in. And that kind of mental confusion, that city architect is improving it. So you're actually looking at improved conditions for people. Sorry if you're getting very confused here. I got very confused. I hope it's unraveled in the book. So I think this is more about the people and the improvement and additions and the hope for the future. The fact that this is a major and optimistic proposal. These people are all going to be liberated. They're all going to be have their lives improved, and I think that's what is going through Annan's mind. And that's why the sequence is not a failure. That's why the sequence is beautiful to look at, and that's why that curious sense of optimism that you can see in it is there. It's meant to be. But that's my theory, and it may be that you you have seen the documents that say he was employed.
But so, Sarah, can I ask then? If you, I mean, everybody and I always thought he was commissioned.
So did I.
So if that wasn't the case, what do you think his motivation was in photographing these streets and clothes?
Well, both he and John Carrick, the city architect, and the Lord Provost who started this off, John Blackie, they were all United Presbyterians. They were all deeply religious. They had very strongly the sense of personal responsibility that's involved in the idea of charity. And if you bear in mind that charity at that time still meant love, not just giving people money, then this is a very important basis. I think he was in there. I think Annan joined in with the work on as an act of charity, as an act of generosity, and that's dictates what he's thinking. The empathy you can feel in photographs which are supposed to be just old buildings. Now, the question, of course, is, if you think of it like that, does that work better for you? Does it make more sense in photographs? And I hope it does. You need to go back and have another look and see whether you think I'm right.
And in fact, one of the things, I mean, when I read the essay in the book, that was the one thing that took me aback the most was that assertion that in fact he wasn't commissioned. Then you're on to the question of, then why did he do it? You know, a possible other reason could be that he, as a commercial photographer, there was a speculative element to what he was doing. He knew that these would be of use at some point in the future, having just had the 1866 Act passed. Another one, of course, is the view that he had a sense of charity about what he was doing. But I'm also curious about something different, which is, because like Robin, I've read other texts that state very clearly, yes, he was commissioned, therefore it's almost like I hadn't questioned that. And I'm interested in your own process in terms of researching the history of photography. Did you go into the research about Annan with any kind of suspicion that in fact this was not the case, or did you just kind of go looking for evidence and not finding it, you then drew the conclusion that no, he wasn't commissioned?
The main problem is that you look at the photographs. I mean, first time I looked at the photographs and wrote about them, which was a long time ago, there is this extraordinary sense of optimism, light, and the washing, which is actually getting in the way of the light that he's trying to take the photographs through. So that washing is there for a reason. He has to have been working with authority, because he couldn't have gone in with all this equipment and got the situation the way he wanted it. And if he was working with authority, somebody could have taken the washing down. If he was saying, you know, I want to be able to see this building, somebody would have said, right, okay, we'll have this done. But it's there, and in some cases it's right there, bang in front in the middle. And that means that he meant something by it. And what he meant by it was that in these appalling circumstances, one of the most difficult things you could do was to stay clean, and for self-respect, for health. It was dirt that generated ill health. All these things, this is a demonstration that the people in the closes are not just victims or subjects of pity, but people who have the capacity to come out of this situation and thrive, I think. But so I was looking at these and thinking, well, there is all this optimism, and what's
Where does that come from?
where does that come from? So I was a bit worried about it, but like you, I thought, yeah, it was a commission. I think because one of the problems we have is that we are obsessed with money motive in modern life. We think we all do things because of money, and that's what leads us all. But if you think about your own life and what you actually do and what you want to do, it's very rarely the things that you're paid to do that you really want to do. But that doesn't stop you doing it. I hope.
Yeah.
You said he was a businessman, Sarah.
Well, this is the thing, that
Yeah.
he's said to be a businessman. I don't think he was a very good businessman.
Yeah. What was his business apart from obviously?
Well, he was a photographer,
That was
but
his
yeah,
business.
and he obviously was a commercial photographer in the sense that he did fantastically good printing. He published. He, for instance, one of the things he did was there was an art lottery in Glasgow, and he produced photographic prints from drawings and paintings for that, and he did a superb job, and that meant that he was producing for any given print, say 20,000 prints, and however, so that it's a large-scale business, and the industry obviously must have been paying him quite a lot, and there's an immense amount of industrial stuff wherever it is. The Mitchell Library turned up a splendid album the other day of railway trains, which are absolutely deadpan, like draftsman's drawings of trains. Side view, you can see everything perfectly. The aesthetic is radically, there's no picturesque in them. So he was obviously being paid for that kind of thing. But this isn't actually my research. Somebody else has Brodie Simpson has found that his own brother, after he died, said that he was not a good businessman because he was too generous. And that's another, I feel, kind of leg under my argument, I hope.
Yeah. And I think it's worth maybe bearing in mind, of course, that he's making at the same time as Valentine in Dundee and Washington Wilson in Aberdeen, who had hugely successful commercial businesses. So although he was a commercial photographer and he took on these important commissions, he wasn't actually making for a mass market of consumers in the same way that eventually those businesses were, with like really high volume of prints being sold and eventually the postcards. That wasn't really the direction that he was going in. I think, last question for me and then we'll open it up. When I look at those photographs and, you can look at them for a long time, there are certain aspects visually within the photographs that are, really engaging, the whole time compression that you see with the people and the washing and so on, that make them just, as I say, intensely engaging. But the other thing is that the sense of history you have in looking at those images, because although they're old, we talked about this yesterday, there are certain themes that almost have a parallel with today, and it's the question, why should we still look at these images today? Why are these images still important? I think some of those historical parallels are part of the answer, but are there other reasons or thoughts that you have on why they're still significant today?
This is a can of worms, isn't it?
It is,
the people are regularly quoted as saying history isn't relevant. And that's one of those kind of put-downs, isn't it? It's a sort of squashing gesture, And there's no way of arguing with that because it sounds very definite and very positive, and we can just get rid of that. But why? I mean, how can you get rid of your history? It's like saying, you know, my parents don't matter. Their lives don't matter. Their parents' lives don't matter. Where do you stop? We weren't found under gooseberry bushes. At least I don't think so. But this is where we come from. This is one of the things that I suspect. Collective amnesia is our modern problem. That we throw away so much, possibly because we have so much, and we have to make sense out of life in different ways. But I have a dark suspicion that people don't read or know the old fables, the old stories, as much as they should do nowadays. And there's one about, like Aesop, I think, which is about who is the king of the birds, who is the best bird, and the eagle says, well, right, yeah. And he flies up, and he flies up, and he flies up, and he gets right to the top of the world, top of the air, and he stops and thinks, right, phew, done, I've proved it. And then there's a sparrow who's been sitting on his back, he hadn't noticed, and he goes, doop, 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 and manages another 6 inches. And he's the top bird. And this is the kind of situation we're in danger of being in, that we are seriously under the delusion that we think, as the sparrow, just doing that all of that doesn't matter and didn't happen. And that's not very bright of us, really. And we're also losing so much. This stuff's fascinating. If you get into the 19th century and you find out what's really happening, the real people and the real things they did, it's astonishing. And it's why we're here now. It's why we are so damn comfortable. We have no idea what people went through, and we should.
Well, thanks very much for that. Unless there's any final questions anyone's desperate to ask, I think we've kind of reached a natural end there.
Thank you.